Okay, you ready? And I kind of really mean that question, are you ready? Because we've just had three extremely erudite speakers, but we all might be feeling a bit fragile after what we've heard today. And this is our therapy session for you. It is an extraordinary honor to be sat in this chair this time round with William Sieghart. You can Google him if you want to know his whole background. I'm not going to use up time doing very much of that. I've done my research, and I'm going to give you 2 words of introduction for William that, from what I can see, run through his career. And one of those words is care. Care for people, care for systems. And the other word is curiosity. What works? Try it out. Which has led you to do some extremely innovative stuff. And we will explore one avenue of your career around poetry and mental health today. And that's what I mean by asking you all, are you ready? We met this morning to think about how today would run, and I think we'd got 200 meters down the road, and both of us were trying to hold back tears. Because it's so important to talk, and mental health is so fragile in this day and age. So are you ready? This session should make you do some emotional work. William, do you sleep through the night?
I have a 4 a.m. problem, which I'm sure you would all recognize. And of course, at 4 a.m, your adult carapace disappears, and you are a child. And of course, if you're a parent, and nobody tells you before you become a parent that you'll be condemned to worry for the rest of your life, 4 a.m. is the worst time. And I don't know about you, I get what I call tumble-dryer mind, where just thoughts circulate, and I can't switch them off, and I can't sleep. And although I live in a city, I have a poem which helps me, I suppose, through those difficult moments. And it's a poem by an American poet called Wendell Berry, and it's called The Peace of Wild Things. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. And for a time, I rest in the grace of the world, and am free.
Why is that poem useful to you?
I find that I sort of mouth it to myself, and it helps me switch off that tumble-dryer mind. I mean, the interesting thing about poetry and reciting poetry, either aloud in your head or aloud, is actually it calms your breathing, it calms your heart rate, and it helps you switch off from what in the modern terms fight or flight that's going on in your head. And it just gives you a prayerful chance to escape from this tumble-dryer effect.
Can you broaden that out then? So that's a specific poem and your relationship to it. But what have you been doing with poetry and people more broadly?
So I've spent my entire adult life trying to get poetry out of Poetry Corner. 30 years ago in the UK, I started a thing called National Poetry Day, which happens every year. and it's a chance for everyone in the country to get over their Anglo-Saxon reticence and get to be a bit poetic. And whether they turn to their loved one and say, "Shall I compare thee?" or whether they abseil down a building reciting poetry, I don't really mind, but it's just a chance for people to celebrate poetry and be poetic. And I also started a big poetry prize, which is also 30 years old, but I still felt that poetry was in Poetry Corner, a little bit back of the bookshop, elitist, exclusive, people on the whole a bit intimidated and frightened of it. And one day, a wonderful friend of mine called Jenny Dyson asked me to a festival, like this kind of festival in England, and she said, "You're always sending me poems to get me through difficult moments. I'm putting you in a tent, and I'm going to call it the Poetry Pharmacy. I've designed you a prescription pad, which she'd printed up. She said, photocopy every poem you can think of that might be helpful to people in their difficult circumstances, and do a poetry pharmacy." So I thought I would probably sit there for an hour or so. After about 5 hours, with a very full bladder, I needed a little bit of a break. And I left the tent, and there was this enormous blackboard outside the tent, and I'd been booked the whole weekend. I needed to get myself a few boxes of tissues, because I found almost everybody cried. And one of the people who came to talk to me worked for the BBC, and the next Saturday, I was on the radio, BBC Radio 4, talking about this. And the producer said, "Oh my God, the emails that are flooding in from people listening to this live show, can you come back for Christmas?" So I came back for Christmas, and the next thing I knew, really, the pharmacy had sort of taken off of its own momentum. And in the UK, the arts minister had coincidentally asked me to do a review of the public library system around the country. And I didn't really want to be a government inspector in a suit, so I offered to do a pharmacy in every library I visited. And after 18 months, I'd listened to over 1,000 people, I think, one-on-one. And that's where my pharmacy really took off. And I began to see, when I prescribed appropriately, people got out of the chair a foot taller. And I began to understand how Jenny had really just transformed my attempts to get people to connect with poetry. Because I think that people reach for poetry in times of need, when they've lost someone, when they've had a broken heart, but they don't really know where to go. They don't really know where to look. And so what I've been lucky enough to be is a kind of a kind of filing cabinet for finding the right poem for the right time. And one day I was doing a pharmacy in London, and I arrived rather late for a dinner, and I was sitting next to a lady I'd never met before and puffing away on my vape because I'd listened to a lot of people's problems and was quite wound up. And she said, "Oh, I've got to get one of those because I've taken up smoking again." And rather inappropriately, and I think I'd probably had an extra glass of wine, I turned to her and I said, "Because you hate your husband." And she gripped me by the wrist and said, "How did you know?" And I said, "I'm really sorry, I shouldn't have said that." And she said, "No, this is so fascinating." And I said, "It's just I've been listening to people's problems all day, I'm acutely sensitive." And she said, Are you a shrink?" And I said, "No, I do this with poetry." And she paused and she said, "Oh my God," she said, "there's a book in this." And she's my literary agent now, and we have 3 volumes.
So how does it work? You do index different types of mental health, and people can look it up and say, "I'm despairing." And
Exactly. You look up how you feel, and so it might be lack of courage. And here I've written a page about this whole condition, lack of courage, and what I've learned from talking to people about it. And then here's the poem I've chosen that I think might be helpful and might give you that sense of... I think the thing is that if you find the right poem, it expresses more elegantly than you could ever express yourself how you feel. And you're not alone. You're not mad. And if this poem was written hundreds of years ago, then everyone's always felt like this. So it sort of normalizes your feelings and makes most people go, phew.
Yeah, I can absolutely see that. But what's it about poetry rather than music or visual arts that has this mental healing effect on people, in your view?
Well, first of all, I feel that poetry, and it's very important to learn how to read poetry. You should read it aloud. Or if you're on the bus aloud in your head, that's really important. You shouldn't read it like fiction or journalism. You should hear it, because you'll hear the musicality and the lyricism. It'll reveal itself more and more as you hear it. But really, we were all brought up with liturgies, of whatever faith we were brought up in. And as children, we probably were taken on a Friday or a Saturday or a Sunday, whatever our faith was, to recite those liturgies, which are filled with poetry communally together. And in our increasingly secular world, we don't do that anymore. And I found, particularly during lockdown, that my gadget was just filled with social media, sending round poems to help all of our difficulties. And I think it's as though the canon of poetry has become the secular liturgy that we all share.
I can definitely relate to that. I don't know if my Albanian teacher's still in the audience, but I translated as part of my Albanian lessons the Irish blessing, the May the World, one road ride up to meet you. And because I was practicing the Desherore, which is a beautiful mood in Albanian. And it's all this, may that happen. And I mistranslated the last word. The last word is, and may God hold you in the palm of his hand until you meet again. But I got the word for God and the word for bird muddled up in my... So I don't think she understood that I was basically saying, may this bird hold you in the palm of hand, and missed the entire meaning of the rather beautiful Irish blessing. Does poetry work in translation?
Only if a poet has translated it, and it's only as good as that translation. For years I was told about the wonders of a poet called Rumi, and many of you, I'm sure you know Rumi, but the translations into English of Rumi were shocking. I didn't get him. And then one day, a new translation came through, and Rumi and Hafez lived through all of these 3 books as a result.
And so they wouldn't have been translating their own work, but the quality of the translation is important.
Indeed.
What's important about the translation? Are you trying to capture alliteration, rhyme, sibilance? Are you trying to mimic the original poet's intention, or is it something more around meter or form?
No, I think it's just got to have the emotional hook translated as much as anything else. It's got to work in the same impactful way it worked in the original.
What do you think makes poems impactful, particularly in this healing use?
In the context of what I'm doing, I'm selecting poetry which is usually short, accessible, and kind. Poetry is a much broader thing than that as an art form, and I publish a book every year of the best entries to the Forward Poetry Prizes, all of that. That's a very different kind of way of looking at it. But in this way, I'm just trying to find poetry written from every part of the world at any time in human history that just might help you.
You're a cipher in this respect for other people's work.
Yes.
Does that bother you?
No, it's an enormous but awful privilege.
Why is it a privilege?
It's an enormous privilege to be able to see so many people through the last 10 years I've been doing this, feel the impact of the poem and help them make a leap forward. And also, I put an email address in the back of all of these books, and so it's a sort of daily process, because I get contacted by people from all over the world. In that sense, we all feel purposelessness at times. We all feel a lack of self-worth. But if you've got the privilege of being able to help someone else every day, that's a blessing.
Can I put you on the spot? I am the mother of 3 amazing young girls. Lack of self-worth is something I notice potentially with them, but also as a feature of social media. So first, short question, could you prescribe something for lack of self-worth? And then second, longer question while you're thinking about that. What are we going to do with social media? And it's a riff that has come up time and time again throughout these 2 days of ideas.
Well, as I said, for any of you who were in the session with Peter, I think it's made us incredibly lonely. Generationally, you'll know that you would have, not that long ago, been sitting on a park bench and turned to the person next to you and had a chat, and now everybody is like that. We think we're communicating with others, but we are wholly isolated from others often. How many of you, the last thing you say goodnight to is your phone, rather than necessarily the person who shares your bed? And the same with the first thing in the morning. If I told you a decade ago that you would spend hours every day looking at a small gadget that you have in your pocket, you would have looked at me and laughed. Yeah. But it is really, really damaging. And I think because as adults we're so addicted, we're not really taking on parental responsibility about it. And schools are just starting to say, we can't have these in schools because it's been that disruptive. So that's very, very damaging. I think also there is this sense now that being alone is a very odd thing to enjoy. It's almost as though being alone is wrong, and that everything has to be reflected on the basis of other people. And I think that's rather not very good for us as well, because I, in my childhood, spent a lot of time alone, and I found that incredibly helpful. I'm trying to find which book I've got this poem in, but hang on, give me a moment.
That's quite all right. And one of the things that we're trying to do with this session, actually, is to slow things down. Because it's Sunday evening, we're all going to have to hit the alarm clock tomorrow morning on a Monday, and we get back into the, 5-day week, 10-hour days. And so that's what I mean when I said, are you ready? This is deliberately slower and more reflective. And I think the gift that you are prescribing all of us right now, William, is that reflectiveness, listening to our breathing, and hopefully you are finding the poem as I am riffing on the concept of a therapy session, but we can get right back into the rat race if it helps with a little bit of pressure.
Well, I'm trying to think where to start, really. I'm going to start with courage, because I think that's important. And I think particularly young people, but all of us, have this terrible fear and dread of tomorrow and the future and whether we're going to pull it off. And lack of confidence, lack of courage is something that comes up pretty quickly after loneliness. And there was a French poet called Apollinaire, and he wrote some wonderful poetry, but an English poet adapted a poem by his, and called Christopher Logue, and this is his poem which I prescribe for lack of courage. Come to the edge, we might fall. Come to the edge, it's too high. Come to the edge. And they came, and he pushed, and they flew.
What do you think COVID did to our ability to engage in this reflective way?
I thought my poetry pharmacy would stop when COVID came. I retired with my family and dog to a little cottage by the sea, and but because of the email addresses in these books, suddenly I actually found that I had a whole new kind of pharmacy. And most disturbing of all, I think, the correspondence came. Sorry, I'm caught up by this, by doctors and nurses who were going through, I'm sure it must have been the same here, what we call First World War conditions. Well, everyone else was at home learning how to bake bread. And afterwards, everyone kept talking post-COVID as though the world had recovered. But only the other day I was in a group like this, and I said, how many of you feel they've fully recovered from that COVID era, and no one put their hand up, which I think is extraordinary. And yet, I recognize it. I think it was an extremely traumatic period, not just because people lost relatives and went through anguish, but particularly for young people, they watched their certainties be uncertain. Their godlike figures of parents and grandparents, you know, sort of lost it, really. And I think the impact of that for those children for decades will continue, but also for the older generation who lost their ability to communicate, to be social. Quite a lot of them haven't really got that back now. So in some ways, this book I produced, this last one, was a reaction to that, and to try and give people a sense of the world again. And I think there's a particular poem which is very beautiful and very simple. It's called Small Kindnesses. It's by an American poet called Danusha Lamaris. And I prescribe it for need for connection. Mm-hmm. I've been thinking about the way when you walk down a crowded aisle, people pull in their legs to let you by. Or how strangers still say, "Bless you," when someone sneezes. A leftover from the bubonic plague. Don't die, we are saying. And sometimes, when you spill lemons from your grocery bag, someone else will help you pick them up. Mostly, we don't want to harm each other. We want to be handed our cup of coffee hot, and to say thank you to the person handing it, to smile at them, and for them to smile back, for the waitress to call us honey when she sets down the bowl of clam chowder, and for the driver in the red pickup truck to let us pass. We have so little of each other now, so far from tribe and fire. Only these brief moments of exchange. What if they are the true dwelling of the holy? These fleeting temples we make together when we say, "Here, have my seat. Go ahead, you first. I like your hat."
One of my personal projects is to thank a driver who stops at a zebra crossing in Tirana. I am trying to spread the word. Please help me with this. It's a cost-free exercise, just to say thank you. And then as a driver, to stop and to acknowledge the pedestrian. These are the types of connections between strangers that will never give you a direct reward. They are non-transactional relationships. And those small kindnesses that are essentially cost-free is something that we may have, as a society, have forgotten how to dole out. One of the spaces where you will see small kindnesses are in community centres. They're different in different cultural contexts. You've done a lot of work with libraries. Here, perhaps the analogy is a cafe or a youth centre or a cultural centre. What's the importance of these now coming out of the bedroom, out of the single person's relationship with a poem and into the communal relationship? What do libraries do for that?
Well, I think first and most important of all, libraries are for loneliness. And quite a lot of libraries in Britain now have started this whole thing of having a loneliness seat. And you go and sit there because you can't want someone to talk to you. Most doctors, most GPs who I've had a lot of engagement with recently, because my work has taken me into the NHS, they say up to 50% of the people who come and see them, that's really what they want to do, is to just connect. They're not necessarily physically that ill, but in this strangely atomized world, they just need someone to talk to.
What kind of place would that be in Albania? I'm not entirely sure, but they're fundamentally democratic because they're free to access. definitely a criterion,
It's
right?
the most important thing, yes. But they're also safe. In our country, libraries are considered the safest place in every community. No one's going to ask you for money. No one's going to judge you for who you are in any way at all. And
unless your book's late.
but also, we have, unless your book's late, that's true. But also, if you want to get on in life, they're a free source of education and cultural improvement one way or another. And it's a mark of a civilized society that we give people free access to learning. It's very important.
So let's go back to the beginning idea of being anti-elitist and poetry out of the corner and out of the slim bookshelf at the end. So how can you reach people who might have different types of challenges? They might have learning difficulties, they might have reading difficulties, they might have social difficulties. How do you get your message of healing, how do you communicate that to people beyond everyone in this room, who sort of by definition, right, is your self-selected group? You want to be here, you want to engage, but how do you get to those other different types of people?
Well, next year, I'm having a bit of an exciting breakthrough, because the National Health Service in our country, which provides free healthcare for all, has sort of taken the poetry pharmacy up, and posters are going up in hospitals and accident and emergency centres, doctors' waiting rooms. They're going to print up in the northwest anything up to 1 million poem cards, which are some of these poems which are being given for free for people who come into those places. And I'm making an app where you can talk into the phone and go, I'm tired, I'm miserable, I'm whatever, and you'll hear a little mini version of my prescription and me reading the poem. And that will all be for free.
We'll have to teach you Albanian language so that you can now do it here, right? Is that a deal?
Yes.
Does strike me as a very cheaply transferable app, actually. And every culture will have different poems of different meanings.
And every culture has poetry has an incredibly important role. And I can see Leah nodding to me, so I take it that poetry is as important to you as it is to us.
I certainly started, school reciting the Walrus and the Carpenter, which definitely helped me out in mental health terms, because I've always liked the ridiculousness of poetry. I'm a big fan of Edward Lear, who obviously spent a lot of time in Albania, but specifically his nonsense poems.
Yes.
Is there poetry that can make us laugh?
All the time. One of my favourite little poems, which I prescribe to people who think that they're never going to have a relationship again, is by a chap called Adrian Mitchell, and it goes like this. It's called Celia, Celia, and he mentions High Holborn, which is a street in London. When I'm sad and gloomy, when I fear all hope has gone, when I walk along High Holborn, I think of you with nothing on.
Well, there you go. I don't want us to get too melancholic in this therapy session, but what I would like to do is open it out to questions, and then I want to come back right at the end for a prescription for all of us. So I'm sort of shifting the Q&A a little bit forward, if that's all right. So you can ask personal questions. You'll have to get better at getting your indexes right for the prescriptions. You can ask literary questions. You can ask philanthropic questions. You do a lot of work in the rest of your life on helping people who are disadvantaged in one way or another. So I can see one hand over there, and one. All right, let's go with these two. The gentleman at the front, and then the lady in the middle over there.
Well, I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much. From your presentation, it looks like poetry is more a form of medicine, as individual psychology. But would it be also efficient for social psychology? Let's say address communities' needs, perhaps included in curricula in the Balkans to address the need for reconciliation, because of the past conflicts. I mean, we as Albanians, we are particularly specialized and talented on a particular poem called Cannabis Sativa, which is a classic. But apart from that, can we also use other forms here?
Yes, definitely. And Hafez
No,
You know
save it.
Hafez
I
more
need
than
you to save that one.
Sorry?
Save that one for
No,
the You're not gonna
don't
read
worry,
it.
he's got
Okay.
plenty.
Oh.
Hafez, I think, if you come from Iran, you'll have Hafez, a book of Hafez's poetry in your house, and people would say that you don't need anything more than that. And 700 years ago, Hafez wrote, "I'm in love with every church and mosque and temple and any kind of shrine, because I know it is there that people say the different names of the one God."
Lady over there.
Yes, let me preface by saying it's going to be a little bit of a provocative question. I myself am a political analyst, but also a graduated pianist. And I would like to bring in a reference from music, since we are about to go into listening to a classical concert later on. One of my favorite quotes is by a composer called Gustav Mahler. And he says, "If a composer could say what he had to say in words, he would not bother trying to say it in music." And actually, I am a great admirer of poetry. But I would like to ask your opinion. What do you think he is referring to when he says this?
I don't know. But I mean, I feel that the restorative power of music is magnificent and goes straight to the heart and soul, and is just as powerful as poetry. I think what poetry can do is give you an express, because the words connect to you. Music is perhaps more, it's not expressed in language, it's going straight to the emotion and soul. So I'm a great believer in both.
So we're trying to connect music with the soul, but actually the poetry is connecting with the head a bit, the
Maybe.
intellectual engagement.
Yes.
And you use this word several times, prayerful.
Or meditative, or yes.
And liturgies.
Yeah.
Question over there.
Thank you for your talk. This also might be a bit provocative, but you know, in the modern day we have these versions of poetry which we call spoken word, and we have. How do you feel about the evolution of poetry? Do you see that as poetry, or do you feel like that's a more diluted version?
No, quite the opposite. I see it as poetry. I embrace all kinds of poetry. I think one of the reasons that as an adolescent you're put off poetry, certainly in schools in my country, is because actually it's poorly taught. Teachers and booksellers and librarians are frightened of it, and they don't think that rap is poetry. And yet the children are all spouting rap left, right, and center. On the radio, when you hear the commercials, they're filled with poetry. There's poetry is all around us. I think I want to give you a little example of this, which is that I've put in these books quite often things that people don't think of as poetry. If you go to Liverpool Football Club and watch a football match, you will hear this as a song. But I think it's a brilliant, brilliant bit of poetry for despair or hopelessness. Walk on through the wind. Walk on through the rain. Though your dreams be tossed and blown, walk on with hope in your heart. And you'll never walk alone. You'll never walk alone. Now that was written for a Broadway musical. And yet, I would say to people in my pharmacy, hope is the one thing no one can take away from you.
Unless you're forced to read Thomas Hardy at 13. And I definitely agree that teaching in schools and getting the pitch right and making it accessible is exactly what you're doing with that. It isn't about the difficult to understand elites writing something that's so highfalutin that you have to pass it line by line to find out what the real meaning is. I mean, the meaning there is very clear to us as listeners.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm trying to connect poetry with large-scale changes, issues that we discussed today. Climate change, poverty, inequality, corruption. So my question is, do politicians, political decision makers care about poetry? And if they don't, what should we do differently?
Ooh.
Can poetry be useful? Thank you.
And can I add a bit on how do we make them care?
I try and be a bit of a poetry commando, and I often put up, certainly when I was younger, I used to fly post, if you know the expression, poster of poems around London, and I would put them at double-decker height, because we have these double-decker buses, and there are these places in London where if you're on a bus, you're going to stop because of the lights or the this or the traffic, and I just put these little bits of poetry in. I built it because I got the idea because we have poems on the underground, on the tube, which somebody started, when I was a child, and I thought it was such a brilliant idea. So I think the whole idea of short poetry as graffiti is a very good way of getting to people.
We've heard from you, so can we go here first, and then was there someone else over there? Where first? Okay, at the front, then at the back, and then if we have time around, I'm trying to make sure everyone gets there.
Yes, thank you for this wonderful talk and session. Since we are living in an area of digitalization, innovation, and the penetration of internet has made us disconnect, but also connect in a way that we didn't thought even about 10 or 20 years ago. So my question is, looking at AI and translation that you mentioned earlier, all AI platforms are trying, and Google has done it the first, are trying to have Google Translate or translate not only literature, but everything that we need in another language. How do you see the relation of AI, innovation, and poetry? Because we mentioned that it's so emotional.
Yes.
So how do you see it?
Well, so far AI hasn't cracked it. Let's put it like that. And every time I've played with AI and poetry, it's extremely disappointing. As somebody put it to me, we have a famous poet called Wilfred Owen who wrote the most moving poems about the First World War. And as somebody said, AI will tell you every single fact that's known about the First World War, but it won't be able to create a Wilfred Owen poem.
I don't think AI really does humour either, does it?
No.
Is there a question right at the back? Oh, yes, there we go. And then the lady in the stripy T-shirt. Should we catch those two questions together?
Hi. I just wanted to ask whether talking to so many people about things that were going wrong for them, or indeed maybe things that were going really right for them. I mean, I personally couldn't be a therapist because I'm too sensitive. But did that encourage you to write yourself personally, or did you find more energy from reading other people's work?
Mm-hmm.
To be honest, I don't write myself, but what I didn't do, because I'm not trained, was I forgot or I didn't know about supervisors. And if you're in the therapeutic trade, you have to offload every week. And it took me a few years to offload, and I regret it, because, as I said, it became an awful privilege.
We end up doing it walking down the road together by mistake. Lady there.
Hello, I'm Dory. Actually, there are two questions, but I'm going to try to put it in one. The first is, what is poetry to you? And the second is, how does the power of poetry relate to freedom and transformation?
Poetry to me is a lifeline, a godsend, a friend, a companion in great need. Definitely it can be used in freedom and transformation. Probably the only voice in the former Soviet Union that was allowed was Anna Akhmatova. She could fill a football stadium of 100,000 people to hear her poetry in the Soviet era. Because in eras of dictatorship and oppression, poetry is about the only way you can disguise dissent.
Dictators aren't very good at subtext, are they?
No.
Gentleman right at the back, and Jackie, in the meantime, will do me a number of fingers. Right.
Okay, hello. I would like to disagree about the point that rap music is not poetry, because there are a lot of classic albums which have whole verses full of beautiful imagery and rhymes and a lot of great stuff.
No, you're right. I wasn't saying it's not poetry. I'm saying it is poetry.
Okay,
but
okay,
it's
sorry.
the teachers who don't think it is poetry.
Okay.
That put all these young students
I
off
misunderstood,
poetry.
yes. Because...
in fact, I'd quite like to do a book at some stage which is called The Poetry of Rap.
Yeah.
Because there's some
very
amazing
good,
stuff.
Very good.
Yeah.
And because I think poetry has two maybe common styles, that one of them can be full of playful and rhythmic rhymes, and another kind would be an insistence on a specific figurative emotions that they want to express to the reader. Like, the valley is green, green is the valley. You know what I'm trying to...
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
We have time for this one right at the front, as long as it's short.
I'll be quick. It's a question on taxonomy, a personal, agonizing question of mine. They're often in Britain. I find this problem in Britain, not in Albania. You see a piece of prose that doesn't really move me. So if it looks like a prose, and it sounds like prose, is it poetry?
Of course it could be. I mean, poetry can be written in all sorts of forms. I think that I will give you an example if I can quickly find it. But does the name Mary Oliver mean anything to anyone? Hello, there you go. Mary Oliver is, I think, one of the most significant poets of the modern era. She tragically died just over a year ago, and she writes sometimes in prose form, sometimes in poetry form, but it really doesn't matter. Whatever she writes, and in whatever shape she writes, it has the most important impact. And I will just give you 4 lines as we're short, but I think this is very important for all of us. It's called The Uses of Sorrow. Someone I loved once gave me a box full of darkness. It took me years to understand that this too was a gift.
So I think what we will do now is ask William to prescribe one last poem to the Albanian nation. You don't have to agree. And then we will finish.
I think the most powerful line of poetry I have been lucky and privileged enough to prescribe was written by Hafez, maybe liberally translated, doesn't really matter. I've now seen it on staircases, on the sides of buildings. It's really taken off. It's my poem for everything, really. And I tell people, my patients, to stick it on the wall, learn it off by heart, say it to themselves every day. I wish I could show you, when you're lonely or in darkness, the astonishing light of your own being.
Thank you very much.